Good. Yeah.
Okay, let's begin. So I'm very happy to welcome again, speaking with us today, Professor John Schock from the University of Cape Town, South Africa, who is visiting us for a couple of months. It's a sabbatical. Professor Schock had his PhD in string theory in University of Southampton in the United Kingdom, and conducted some postdoctoral studies in Beijing, Santiago de Compostela, and Munich, before taking a lectureship in University of Cape Town, during which time he became interested in other topics, including machine learning and cognitive science, and conducts a range of research lines with his group, including a lot of focus on reinforcement learning, but also with us here, some collaboration on the modeling of human behavior in cognitive tasks and understanding human cognition through the use of machine learning models. So I'll pass over to John, and thank you very much for joining us.
Wonderful. Can everybody on Zoom hear me okay?
Yes, thanks.
Not just 10%.
Okay, great. Very good. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ben, for the really kind introduction. Thank you for being here today. I know that this is sort of out of season and maybe not the easiest of timing. Oh dear. And we have some technical difficulties, but let's see. Okay. So the first thing that I want to say is that this talk isn't quite what I'd expected at the beginning, and I think part of the reason for that is AI. So when Ben asked me what I'd like to talk about, I thought, let's have a really catchy title and let's think about what we're going to put in it afterwards, which is a bad idea. But then worse than that, I put together a list of the things that I wanted, and I thought I would try Gamma app, which is a presentation making AI system. So I put my sort of list of bullet points of what I'd like in there, and I threw it into Gamma, and it gave me what looked like a really nice presentation with lovely images and bullet points and pyramids and all sorts of things. But it turns out that taking that and then massaging it into a form that I was happy with is actually really difficult. And again, I think it's part of this sort of cognitive offload that we have the tendency to do, to take the thinking that we're trying to do and put it into an AI system. It stopped there for a moment. Okay, we'll go with it. And put it into an AI system. And I think what I'm discovering, I should only talk nicely about technology, and then we'll be well. What I'm discovering is that this sort of the flow, the cognitive flow, is sometimes helped by AI, but also seems to be really hindered. Can be hindered by AI if we don't use it really carefully. And so this talk actually isn't quite what I was hoping for. This is the first time I've given a talk quite like this. And so I'd like to make it sort of as interactive as possible, ask questions. I sort of planned it as if none of you knew about AI, but everybody here does. It's absolutely fine if not, but is there anybody in the Zoom room that doesn't know sort of the basics of machine learning? That is to say, like, what a neural network is, even if you don't know the details of it. Is anybody brave enough to put out their hands and say, I don't know what a neural network is? I'm going to take that as a no. Okay, either everybody knows or you're not brave enough, but that's fine. Okay. So good outcomes of this talk. So really what I would like you to leave with here is hopefully a single thing that you would like to go and look up later. That'd be great. I'd be happy with that. I want your curiosity to be sparked. If you had a good sleep during this hour or so, that's also fine. Sleep is important. If there was too much jargon and you didn't understand anything, or it was just too obvious, both of those things are bad. If you disagree with me, great. So yeah, just think about one thing that you want to take away from this, that you want to go, hang on, that seemed really interesting. I'd like to find out more, and then I'll be happy. So who am I? I'm at the University of Cape Town. As Ben said, I'm an associate professor there in the maths department, maths and applied maths. I've moved from string theory more and more into machine learning over the last few years, but I've always had a real interest in the brain. It's sort of this thing that if you've tried to understand the universe from the string theory point of view and you couldn't quite do that, then what's the other complicated thing in the universe? Well, it's the brain. So, well, you might as well move over to that and see if you can solve that. And I haven't really solved either, but I find them both very interesting. Okay, just ignore it. Okay. So why should you trust me? Well, I'm going to give a talk here about artificial intelligence and to some extent aspects of cognitive science. And I'm neither a computer scientist nor a cognitive scientist, so you probably shouldn't trust me. But again, if there are little bits that you take away and you then go and look up later, then we're all good. So the map of this talk, I want to talk a little bit about Carnot-chauvinism, which is a term that I sort of thought must be out there, but it turns out that I've come up with it and I can't find it on Google. So if you don't know what Carnot-chauvinism is, that's fine because nobody's ever said it before. But you will hopefully know what it means. I'll then talk a little bit about the sort of two ways of thinking about the brain and indeed the connection to artificial intelligence. And I want to spend quite a lot of time in the talk talking about analogy at the heart of intelligence. And those of you who've read Gerd Bach or any of the books by Douglas Hofstadter will recognize this. I then want to talk about what do large language models bring us. So is there something beyond sort of the traditional neural networks that large language models bring us that maybe was missing before and has given us something, well, pretty surprising? Then a little bit about reinforcement learning and active inference. Just a kind of quick overview, but some interesting things about what we might need to think about in terms of human intelligence when we try to model the behavior of animals and humans. And then the question, what if brute force is just enough? If we don't need to really understand anything in order to create AI systems that can do what we do, what if it's just bigger and better and it seems to solve the whole problem? So strangely, I actually want to read something to you, if you'll indulge me for a couple of minutes, if I have it here. So this is a short story by Terry Bisson. Does anybody know this? Has anybody heard this? So I'll just read a couple of minutes of it if you'll indulge me. So this was actually, it was done as a radio play around 1991. They're made out of meat. Meat? Meat, they're made out of meat. Meat. There's no doubt about it. We picked several from different parts of the planet, took them aboard our recon vessels, probed them all the way through. They're completely meat. Oh, that's impossible. What about the radio signals? The messages to the stars? They use the radio waves to talk, but the signals don't come from them. The signals come from machines. So who made the machines? That's who we want to contact. They made the machines. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Meat made the machines. That's ridiculous. How can meat make a machine? You're asking me to believe in sentient meat? I'm not asking you. I'm telling you, these creatures are the only sentient race in the sector, and they're made out of meat. Maybe they're like the orphaloi, a carbon-based intelligence that goes through a meat stage. Nope, they're born meat and they die meat. We studied them for several of their lifespans, which didn't take too long. Do you have any idea of the lifespan of meat? Spare me. Okay, maybe they're only part meat, like the waddle-eye, a meat head with an electron plasma brain inside. Nope, we thought of that. Since they do have meat heads like the waddle-eye, but I told you, we probed them, they're meat all the way through. No brain? Oh, there's a brain, all right. It's just that the brain is made out of meat. So what does the thinking? You're not understanding, are you? The brain does the thinking, the meat. Thinking meat? You're asking me to believe in thinking meat? Yes, thinking meat, conscious meat, loving meat, dreaming meat. The meat is the whole deal. Are you getting the picture? Oh my God, you're serious then? They're made out of meat? I wonder whether in the future, when AI systems have taken over and humans are long forgotten, whether there will be some conversation that goes, how on earth did, these bits of meat do the thinking? It's such a strange thought. We understand to a better extent the information processing that goes on inside AI than we really know about what happens in the brain. And of course, that's because we designed neural networks and symbolic AI and these sorts of things, and we can follow them. And even if there's the problem of the black box, which is where you have a neural network where you don't necessarily know precisely how it's doing things at the sort of symbolic level inside, you can tell, precisely the information flow. We have the probe into these things. Whereas, we've been studying the brain for at least 100 years in terms of understanding the connections, and there's still so much that we don't understand, both in terms of the way memory functions, the way learning functions, but of course the extreme end of the spectrum, consciousness. Where does that come from? And I'm going to talk sort of tangentially about that a little bit at the end. Okay, but I do want to coin this term, and please spread the word, carno-chauvinism, this idea that there is something special about meat, that meat is the thing that can do the thinking and silicon cannot. So I think it's interesting to ask, what are the barriers to sentient machines? And what is it that makes the meat in our brain special that these things don't have? And indeed, whether these are maybe dangerous questions to ask. So I think that in understanding the way the brain works, there's a tendency to then try and instantiate it in a computer. And there's a question then, what happens if we do happen to create a sentient machine? So I do some advisory work for a company called Consium, which is really interested in this idea about AI consciousness, not in terms of trying to create it, but in terms of saying this is potentially really dangerous and may result in massive scale, what are called mind crimes. So the idea of a mind crime is the creation, for instance, of an artificial intelligence system that does have feelings, that does have consciousness, but may be suffering. And of course, if we're able to propagate these across computers around the world, one could imagine that you could create massive suffering, potentially, particularly if you don't understand it. And so one of the ideas of this organization, Consium, is to say, how would we detect consciousness in artificial systems? Maybe it's going to look something like the consciousness that we have. Maybe it's going to look like something different. But what are the possible ingredients that might need to go into it in order to give rise to consciousness? And what are the signs that we might have? And I'm in conversation with them at the moment, and it's a really interesting, difficult conversation to have, because the tests that we might have for consciousness, it's so easy to say, well, from a behavioral perspective, we can just code that up. Whatever behavior you think of, you can think that some algorithm could be complex enough to give rise to this thing that looks conscious, but then you look in at the source code and you see that it's for loops and if statements. And as soon as you see that there are for loops and if statements there, and you can see the running of the logic, then all of a sudden there's no place for consciousness. And I find this quite an interesting thing, that at the moment what we're asking, and I'll come on to it later, is about sort of affective consciousness. What are the reasons that we seem to have affective consciousness related to essentially feeling? Why do we have that, and how might it be instantiated, and how might you be able to spot it in silicon? So if we want to understand the brain, there are broadly two different ways to think about this, and ways to understand the working of the brain. One is sort of the connectionist perspective, which is that it's the architecture that's important and everything else follows from this. And you will see different definitions for connectionism and functionalism out there. And the drawing I have here are some of the images, the drawings created by Santiago Ramón y Cajal, who was a Spanish neurologist at the end of the 19th century, who created the first really detailed images of nerves in the brain. And these are just a few of the different types of neurons that he drew. And this was really the first look that we had of this sort of connectionist structure within the brain. And this has given rise eventually to sort of the connectome and all of these sorts of things, which is the kind of larger scale structure of the way parts of the brain are connected. But this was the first time we saw these in real detail, and they were mapped out, that there were many different types of neurons in the brain, and they were connected in different ways. And somehow the functioning of the brain maybe could be understood by some sort of flow through these things. And at the time, we didn't understand about the electrophysiology of this, or electrochemistry. But since this time, we've understood so much more about the way neurons speak to each other. Is this okay? Yeah, okay. The way neurons speak to each other, what's happening at the electrical level, at the chemical level. But I'll talk about in a little bit the fact that even a really deep understanding of this doesn't seem to be enough in terms of simulating what's going on. And then there's the functionalism perspective, which sort of says it's what the brain does that matters. The substrate, or indeed the mode of computation, doesn't matter. So that is to say that if you created a system which had the same behavioral features that we have, then internally, the internal experience would be very similar to the experience that we have. I've also got this quote here by George Box from 1976, where he said that all models are wrong and some are useful. And I think that's a really, really important point to take away, is that you come up with a model and you want to test whether or not it has some similarities to the real system that you're looking at. You should always know that the model is wrong. Okay? The question is whether or not it's useful, but more than that, in which domain is it useful? Okay? The model is not going to be an exact replica of reality. Reality is the thing, and you might have some mathematical description of it, but of course there's always going to be things that you can't include. Any true model of one single system, isolated system, well, there's always going to be relationships with what's going on outside. There's always going to be approximations there. The question is, within what domain is the model actually useful? And one can ask, if you've got a sort of connectionist picture of the brain, a functionalist picture of the brain, these are going to be useful in different domains, and there might be some regions where both of them are actually going to be important. So the connectionist view here, we can take that and we can say, what does this look like from an artificial intelligence perspective? And here we've got a picture of the connectome, this sort of large-scale mapping of the major routes of neurons in the brain that lead from one region to another region. We know that there are these neurons that really bridge across major distances within the brain. And then, of course, on the right here, we've got a picture of two neurons connected. And it's this sort of cartoon picture. Most neurons in the brain are connected to between 1,000 and 10,000 other neurons between the axons and dendrites via synapses. But we have this picture that one neuron sends a signal down its axon and via the synapse connects to the dendrites of another neuron, and then that neuron integrates the information from all the incoming signals. And when the signal is high enough, having integrated the information, it sends a signal, an electrochemical signal down the axon to the next ones. And that seems to be fundamentally the information processing system of the brain. Of course, there are many subtleties. There are lots of questions about inhibitory and excitatory neurons, about the different neuromodulators and neurotransmitters. But this broadly is sort of what we're taking away from the brain and saying, how do you instantiate that in an artificial system? So in fact, the perceptron here, so this is Frank Rosenblatt with his perceptron in 1958. This wasn't actually the first time somebody had taken these ideas and put them into silicon. Really the first was the Pitts-McCulloch neuron around 20 odd years earlier than this. And the story of Pitts is a fascinating one, and I'm not going to go into the details of it, but essentially Pitts, who was a young student at the University of Chicago, and McCulloch, who was his sort of mentor at the time. Pitts was actually living in the house of McCulloch and his wife, and they would talk each night about their mutual interests. McCulloch was about the brain. Pitts was about formal logic, really, really formal logic. And they started to discuss, and they said, well, can we actually come up with a mathematical model of a neuron? And the model that they came up with was a very simple one, a sort of binary model of a neuron. But the Pitts-McCulloch neuron was the first picture of a sort of a neuron put into a mathematical language. Frank Rosenblatt in 1958 put together this machine, which was the perceptron and is really at the heart of neural networks. It's the thing which essentially says, let's take in information from perhaps pixels and have some signal processing on those bits of information, some way to add them up such there's an output. In the same way that information comes into your brain, something happens, the information is processed in some way, signals are added and subtracted and weighted via the synaptic connections, and then there's some output. And what he was doing there was related to character recognition. And in fact, the perceptron was then taken and was used by the US Post Office to be able to sort letters by their postcodes automatically. And this was a huge deal. At the time, essentially what Frank Rosenblatt had to do was to tune this thing more or less by hand. So that is to say, let's start with a brain which has some random set of connections. You give some signal in, and there's going to be some random output. There's going to be some random behavior. But you can then move the neurons in the brain around a little bit, and the behavior is going to be different. And if you have enough time, you can move them around in all sorts of different ways until you find that it's starting to give you more of the outputs that you want. And that's essentially what was happening here. At the time, the New York Times said of the perceptron that this is the embryo of an electronic computer that the Navy, it was funded by the Navy, expects will be able to walk, talk, see, write, reproduce itself, and be conscious of its existence. And this was maybe a little preemptive in 1958, but now maybe we're not that far away from, well, certainly from all of the things I would say. Reproduce itself, well, we can certainly create systems which can reproduce themselves. Be conscious of their existence. Maybe we're not there yet. Maybe we are. I think probably not, but it's a debate that I think is a reasonable debate to be having now. And then on the right, we have a sort of cartoon of an artificial neural network. I wonder if I can move this around in some. Okay, let's try that. Actually, I didn't put this down here. We have a picture of a neural network on the right-hand side, and this is what's called a deep neural network. And the idea of a deep neural network is that you take these units, the perceptron units, which Frank Rosenblatt came up with, and you put them together in layers with multiple of them in each layer, such that there is more complex information processing that happens from the input, which might be a picture here of a dog, and there's going to be some output. In this case, it might be a binary output. It's trying to tell you whether or not you've got a picture of a cat or a dog there. And here it's given the output cat, and so what you need to do is take that error and back propagate it through the whole system. That is to say, update the synaptic connections or the weights of the neural network such that next time you give it a picture that looks like that, it outputs the correct label. So just to give a sort of a bit of a history of the connectionist timeline. So on the left here, we have again a deep neural network. This again is just characterizing handwritten digits from the MNIST data set. You pass it through and it gives you the probability of it being a particular digit. And with this particular weighting of the neural network, it outputs that this is likely to be, what is it, an 8 or an 8 here. And of course, that's wrong. This is a 3. And so you look at the difference in the probabilities. You want it to be saying that this is definitely a 3. At the moment, it's saying it's probably an 8. And so you look at that difference, and it's the difference that you then take and back propagate through the system and update the weights so that in the future, things that look a bit like this are going to output a 3 more likely. So 1958, we had the perceptron. 1969, Minsky and Papert put out this book all about perceptrons. And to a large extent, this was sort of the beginning of the end at the beginning of neural networks, this sort of the really strong connectionist perspective. Because what they showed was that the perceptron in and of itself was very limited. There were certain very simple problems that you couldn't solve with a perceptron. That is to say, you couldn't do certain types of classification. In fact, within the book, they then said what would be needed in order to overcome this. But most people seem to ignore that and just say, well, perceptrons are not very good. This is not the direction to go. And indeed, for many reasons, at the time, it probably wasn't the right way to go, in the sense that the computational power that was available at that time wasn't really enough to do particularly interesting problems, the types of things that we can do now. The first AI winter, I'm wondering, yeah, the first AI winter came about in around 1972, which actually came about from the Lighthill report, amongst a number of other things, that essentially said that the ideas that people had thought were going to be possible at the time, from this sort of connectionist point of view, just hadn't come to pass, and lots of funding was withdrawn. It says there, in no part of the field of the discoveries made so far produced the major impact that was then promised. We have here a cartoon of John Searle and the Chinese room, and this is the idea. If you have a room where there is a signal fed in Chinese, and inside there is a person who doesn't speak any Chinese, but there's a lookup table, there's a rule book that says this Chinese symbol maps to that Chinese symbol. And they're able to essentially utilize this to give sensible outputs. There is no way that the thing inside has any understanding of what's going on. And essentially they said, if it's just this sort of symbolic manipulation that's going on, how can there possibly be any real understanding going on? And so these systems that people have been coming up with, which to some extent were about symbolic manipulation, how could they possibly have a real understanding? Whereas our brain seemingly does have a real understanding. And so the question there was, what is the missing ingredient? 1972, actually at the same time, recurrent neural networks came along. And what these were able to do was to say, well, we can deal with image data in a very sort of crude sense. We can characterize digits, and this was way before convolutional neural networks, the perceptron. But at the time, they could at least deal with categorizing digits, the types of things on postcodes. But sequence data was much, much harder. And so Shinichi Amari came along and showed that actually, if you created essentially a loop within a neural network where what was fed in then went back out to the inputs, this recurrent layer allowed you to process sequences. And the way to think about this is that as I tell you each word, something is stored in your brain. There is a hidden state which is created in your brain. So if I tell you such a bad movie, by the time I get to the word movie, your brain has already been updated with the word such a bad. Okay. So I tell you the word the series of words such a bad, your brain is now in a state that the word movie now updates it again. But it's really important that there was a memory of what had come before. If there wasn't a memory, then you're just going to be processing each word individually, and that's not going to tell you anything. But of course, you can use this for things like sentiment analysis. So maybe you want to tell if movie reviews are good or bad. And so you can take this recurrent neural network and essentially unroll it. So that is to say, you take this recurrent unit and you unroll it so that you've got multiple layers where each of the layers is just one of the tokens, one of the words, which is going in. And you're then able to do sentiment analysis. You're able to do crude translation, at least. And it might be that there you have some input words and some potential output words in another language, and you're then able to do things like translation. This is fine for short sequences, but for long sequences, this just doesn't work. For long sequences, essentially, it's not able to keep all of the information in mind. So that is to say, if I was trying to tell you to update your brain in some essentially linear fashion with all of the words that I say, then actually you wouldn't do very well at all. As I'm speaking to you, there will be certain parts of what I'm saying that you do use to update what's in your brain, and there are certain bits that you're throwing away. Of course, you're not doing this consciously, unless you are doing consciously, in which case, fine. But essentially, your brain is very good at saying what are the salient features of what's incoming, and you have essentially gating units there. In a very crude sense, you have gating units which say this piece of information is important. You should remember this, and that piece of information isn't very important. Don't use this to majorly update the state of your brain. Okay, but that wasn't included here. 1986, Geoffrey Hinton and others came up with backpropagation, and backpropagation essentially said, how do we actually train these neural networks in an efficient manner and backpropagation by gradient descent allowed the updating of the weights in the neural network in a much more efficient way than had been done previously, where essentially you take this error and you pass the error through the layers using some pretty simple calculus and linear algebra in order to calculate how each weight should change in order to move the system to a lower error rate. Then 1989, Schmidhuber and others came up with the convolutional neural network, and this was a really nice example of a sort of parallel between real brains and the AI systems, because what's happening in a convolutional neural network, which is the type of architecture which is really good for analyzing images, this sort of architecture has a very similar structure to what happens in the real visual system. And the experiments by Hubert and Wiesel showed in cats, they found these essentially filters. You could show that you can turn off and on these filters in fairly cruel ways. But the filters that are in the eye that pick up low-level features actually have a perfect correspondence, well, not perfect correspondence in the George Box sense, a good enough correspondence with what's going on in the convolutional neural network, where you have these filters that essentially moves across the image and picks up low-level features. And then as you move through the neural network, each layer is picking up higher and higher sort of more and more abstract features. So it might be that the first layer is just picking up lines, horizontal, vertical lines, dots, regions of contrast. It might be that the next layer is picking up things that look a little bit like noses and eyes and mouths if you've trained it on faces. The next layer is taking those, the outputs of those, where it might say there's this type of eye and there's this type of nose, putting them together, and eventually you might have stereotyped faces which correspond to happy faces and sad faces. And from there, it then tells you whether or not the input image, which was essentially broken down into these very small level features and then more and more abstract features, it'll tell you whether or not the image was a happy face or a sad face. The second AI winter came around the 1990s, early 1990s. And this was to do with a different way of thinking about artificial intelligence. This was expert systems, where expert systems are a little bit more like the sort of functionalist approach. And I'm going to talk in more detail about this approach in a moment. 1997, LSTMs, again, Jürgen Schmidhuber. LSTMs are long short-term memory, and they were able to overcome this problem that not all information which comes in a sequence is as important as all other information. LSTMs essentially have this gating mechanism where it's able to say this information is important, that information is not important. And they're able to deal with much longer strings, much longer sequences in an efficient manner. And then we get to around the 2010s. Oh, so that stopped completely. Okay, 2010s. Don't worry about the enormous amount of information on the slide, but essentially by the 2010s, we got to the point that convolutional neural networks were good enough that they could be trained on, and this was really important, enormous amounts of data and get to superhuman levels. So the ImageNet challenge had a huge number of images, and it wasn't just, cat or dog. It went down in really fine-grained details. Here we've got Siberian Husky on the right and trimaran. And so it went down to these fine-grained details where you might imagine the average human, you look over a large number of humans, and they might not all know what a trimaran is or a Siberian Husky is. And these systems, not just because of the architecture, not just because of the backpropagation, the training algorithm, but because of the enormous amount of labeled data, and importantly, the compute capacity to do this, they were able to train to superhuman levels such that they could classify really, really accurately. So then we got the other side of things, the sort of good old-fashioned AI, related essentially to symbolic manipulation, but you will find many different definitions of good old-fashioned AI. But these are things like expert systems, where it might be a set of very well-defined rules. And on the right here, there's an XKCD comic. So this is a guide to the medical diagnostic and treatment algorithm used by IBM's Watson supercomputer. Have a look at that later if you want. But essentially, it's a sort of flowchart that says, if this happens, if there's this particular symptom related to this particular thing, then this is the likely outcome, or this is the thing that you should do next. Of course, this needs to be programmed. This needs to be coded generally by an expert. And so this is why it's called an expert system, where a knowledge base is created, where there may be some sort of ontology, some relationship between elements in the world. And from that, you can pull out a decision tree or whatever it might be. So there might be some query from the user and an output, but it's not just a neural network where the information is encoded in the weights of the neural network. In this case, it's sort of these symbolic logical rules that say, if this happens, then that happens. You can think of this as a very kind of deterministic system, but you can come up with ways of doing this probabilistically, and you can come up with ways of having these sorts of knowledge bases or ontologies where you have some uncertainty within the system. So here you see a relationship, essentially a very simple ontology between penguin and bird and has wings and flies. And of course, a penguin is a bird, and most birds do fly, but penguins don't fly. And so you need some sort of subtlety within this sort of system that you will then want to read out in order to answer questions about penguins or anything else. So one might ask the question, can we just build a model of the brain and switch it on? So here, the big image on the top right is just a picture of Moore's law that just says that the number of transistors that you can fit on a chip and the computing power that we have available to us doubles roughly every 1.5 years. So you might think that you could take an organism, and on the left here we have a C. elegans, a nematode worm. And a nematode worm is really simple. It's essentially the simplest organism with a nervous system. It has around 300 neurons with a few thousand synapses, has around 1,000 cells in total. And so you might think that if you take the structure of the C. elegans, which we know in real detail, try that again. It seems to be sharing here. Okay.
Maybe stopped there.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. Okay. So we have a C. elegans, and we know the structure of the C. elegans. We now have a lot of computing power. We also have pretty good simulations of physics, of fluid dynamics. So you might think that, well, if I have this thing where there are 300 odd neurons, surely I can just code up the dynamics of the 300 neurons, taking into account the particular synapses, the particular neurotransmitters related to each particular neuron, which we know in detail, and we can put it into silicon, and it should give us something that, well, acts like a C. elegans. And the Open Worm project was an open source project distributed across many researchers around the world, where they tried to do precisely this. And indeed, they got some way. They were able to get essentially a two-dimensional version of this moving around, and indeed it moves somewhat like a C. elegans moves. But the actual comparison between the real behavior of C. elegans and the in silico behavior, from what I understand, just hasn't been able to match up yet. So if we can't do this for C. elegans with 300 neurons, how are we going to do it for a human brain with, what, 80 billion odd neurons? And things like this is what things like the Human Brain Project was trying to do, or the Blue Brain Project, sorry. The Blue Brain Project was trying to say, can we simulate eventually an entire human brain? And they were starting off with a single cortical column. With a single cortical column. And unfortunately, although around €1 billion was put into this project, the outputs really weren't as good as those that had been promised, that we would soon be able to simulate a whole human brain. And the fact that we struggle with 300 neurons tells us that not necessarily, it's we don't have enough computing power, but there's something missing here. And I think this is really interesting. I think it's the questions when something doesn't work, and we have to ask, what is the ingredient, or what are the ingredients which are important, whereby our model goes from being wrong and not useful to wrong and useful. Okay? And so I think that being able to look at models like this and say, what might it be? Might it be something that we're missing in the neurotransmitters? Might it be something that we're missing in the dynamics? Might it just be a chaotic system? But if it's a chaotic system, then sure, not every nematode would act the same. But of course, behavior tends to be, even if not deterministic, there's some tendency. Chemotaxis says that if there's a source of a food over here, the nematode worm will move towards it in a particular way. And so even if you don't want to have sort of deterministic behavior that tells you precisely what's going to happen, you do want something which is going to be broadly in the right direction. Okay. So we've got these kind of two viewpoints. One is the connectionist viewpoint, and one is sort of moving around symbols, the good old-fashioned AI. So yes, we know that in the brain, the substrate is neurons and their connections. But internally, our subjective experience is of kind of moving around symbols, okay? We've got this space of concepts, and we move around the space of concepts, sometimes in this sort of, real graphical way I can imagine. And so can most people who don't have aphantasia. You can move an apple around in your head. You can do this sort of symbolic manipulation. You can move words around in your head. And the internal experience has nothing to do with, seemingly, the neuronal firings. That's all integrated out. What happens when you're actually thinking isn't the firing of neurons, even though that's the substrate, it's the moving around of symbols. Clearly also tool use is vital for our own intelligence. Okay? We can do a lot of thinking just by sitting there and letting it happen in our brains, but a huge amount of what we do in the world happens via the tools that we have access to. So, it does seem that some combination of neurosymbolic AI may not be necessary in terms of the fact that we do know that the brain does it all just by, this sort of connectionist picture. But it might be a useful way to solve this problem where, we might not have enough computational power to code up 80 billion neurons, and there are 1,000 to 10,000 more synapses than that. But if we can code up something which has some of those similarities to a neural network, but allow it access to the symbolic side of things as well, where it's able to manipulate these symbols, maybe that's going to give us something. There's a book that I read, I guess, about 10, 15 years ago called Fluid Concepts and Creative Analogies by Douglas Hofstadter that really I found fascinating. And it's a book which focuses on analogy being at the heart of intelligence. And, maybe this isn't entirely true, but I do think that there's something really important here. Who here has been in this room before? 1, 2, 3. Many of you haven't. For those of you who haven't, you had no problem coming through the door, finding a seat, sitting down, and looking in the right direction. And that's because you've done this many, many times before. And you could draw an analogy between all the lecture rooms you've been in and this one. Yes, there are differences, but you know how to navigate those differences because those differences have analogies as well, right, that you have encountered. If there happened to be a fire over there, maybe that's not a difficulty that you've encountered before. And so you wouldn't know how to overcome it, but you might then draw an analogy between that and something that you've seen. You might know how to put out fires because ... So thinking about the way we see the world through analogies, every situation you find yourself in has some analogy to past situations. We use analogies all the time in the way we solve problems. We look at a problem and we think, consciously or not, what are the relationships between this problem and a problem that I've solved before? In the book, Fluid Concepts and Creative Analogies, what he does is he talks about essentially a program, and I mean a program by a set of sort of projects that he set up in his lab, which were asking the question, how do we get computers to do things in the way that we do them? On the right here, I've got an anagram. Okay. Can anybody figure out what the anagram is? And I've set this up specially such that it works in English and in Finnish. It probably doesn't work in Spanish, or indeed in Chinese, or Russian. But can anybody see what this anagram is in English and Finnish?
Mhm.
Any of the Finnish speakers? Yes? No? Yeah?
The last one, and go to the next.
Oh, sorry, I'm talking about the one on the right. Sorry. So on the right, these letters, OSORMETH. Does anybody know what this is an anagram of in Finnish? It is. Okay, very good. And in English, it's oh, oh no, it's not. I'll tell you, it's smoother. And ChatGPT did help me out this time. Smoother in English. So it also means like a nervous system, is that right? So it means nervous system, or it means smoother. So what happens in this book is that he says, okay, it's really easy to get a computer to solve anagrams. You get it to list out all the different combinations, and then you look each one up in a dictionary, and if it's in the dictionary, tick, great, anagram. That's not the way you solved that just now. What you did just now was that a lot of it is to do with chunking. That you looked at this and you might see in English, TH appears very often together. So the T and the H sort of fit together, and then you move things around, and you're doing all of this symbolic manipulation. You're doing things either visually or sort of sub-visually, that you're moving these things around in order to put them together in ways that feel natural. Okay? There's two O's there. Two O's go together in English very often. And in doing that, there is no way that you are going through the combinations of the different letters. There's some interesting symbolic manipulation going on there. And the whole of the book is about this, different problems where in order to get a computer to do it, you need to think hard about the way humans do it. And so he's got a whole load of different examples there. One of them is actually, if I gave you 3 letters, if I designed a font, and I gave you the first 3 letters of that font, then you could probably take those and you could write the rest of the alphabet in that font. And what you would be doing there would be drawing analogies. You'd be drawing analogies between the straight line in a B and the straight line in a P. And you would be saying, well, there's some similarity between this and this. So because I've seen this example, I know how to take it over to that example. I'm just reading another book of his, Surfaces and Essences, where again, he's really going into analogy, particularly through language. But he's got this really nice example of a game. If I were to say, there's some rule that takes ABC to ABD, what would XYZ go to? And there's no right and wrong rule here. Okay? I just want some examples of what you think XYZ might go to if ABC goes to ABD. XYA, okay. And XY.
Finnish alphabet.
Oh,
Continues. So
oh, okay. Perfect. So there we've got 2 answers, one of which you've seen the alphabet there as a sort of cycle, like the days of the week, or a pack of cards where the ace there is both a high card and a low card. Or you've seen a sort of cipher where the alphabet does go around in a cycle. So you're taking this, and without any of that, it would make no sense to go from Z to A. No, A is the first letter of the alphabet. You have to think about it cyclically. There are lots of other ways to think about this. You could say that XYZ goes to XYZ, because the rule seems to be that C goes to D, and there's no C in there. You could also say that maybe XYZ goes to WYZ, because the C, which is the 3rd letter from the beginning, goes to the D, which is the 4th letter from the beginning, and X is the 3rd letter from the end and goes to the 4th letter from the end. There are lots of different ways to think about the same problem. But all of them, it's about drawing the analogy here between that first line, the set of rules that you've used for the first line, and what it is you should do for the second line. And there is no right and wrong answer to this. There are many different ways of doing it. And thinking about those different ways is about seeing the problem in different ways. In Surfaces and Essences, Hofstadter gives this really nice example of the relationship between moon with a capital M and moon with a small m. And he talks about the Galileo's insight. This one, as you can see, was created by the AI system. This whole slide has sort of got this particular format that you'll probably see in lots and lots of presentations from now on, for better or worse. But Galileo's insight was to look at Jupiter over time and look at the dots and see that they were moving around it, and drawing an analogy between those things that were moving around it and the moon, which previously had always been moon with a capital M. There is this one thing, and it is the moon. And in drawing the analogy with this discovery between the moon up here, which seems to be moving around us, and the things moving around that, we went from the idea of a moon to the idea that moons were a thing. Moons were a generic category that weren't just this thing, they were things that seemed to move around bodies in the universe. And this, although it's just moon with capital M to moon with a little m, is a huge difference. It's a huge change in our conceptual understanding of what moon means. So Hofstadter's idea really is that analogy is at the heart of thought and of creativity. And we can use this for bridging concepts. So is it right that we have more or less until 12 in theory? Okay. So there's a question here about whether large language models change the game. And I'm going to presume that people broadly know here what large language models are. I thought we might have a sort of closer to retirement age group here where I would have to go into lots of details about LLMs, but I'm not going to go into lots of details about it. But LLMs are really interesting because they're essentially quite simple systems, which are just neural networks. They've got a particular architecture. But what they're doing in some sense is a sort of symbolic manipulation. When you give it a set of words, for instance, big happy mole, what the LLM does is it looks at the relationships between them. So if I tell you the word mole, mole on its own has many meanings. Mole can mean a spy, mole can mean a mole on the skin, mole can mean a small burrowing animal. And in and of itself, it just lives at some point in our space of ideas where that word mole has multiple meanings. To create something more specific, we have to give it some context. And that's really what LLMs do, is that they allow the context of other words to change the meaning of a particular word. And so in this concept space, happy sits at some point, and big sits at some point, and mole sits at some point. In and of themselves, they're not particularly useful, but you put them together, and this is a really kind of rough cartoon of it, but you put them together, and essentially what happens is that the last word in the sequence, mole, gets moved around by the other words to sit at some point in space where it now corresponds to the concept of a big happy mole, okay? Which again might be slightly ambiguous. And in fact, so maybe it's a big happy spy, and maybe it's a big happy burrowing animal. So you would need to look at more of the context to disambiguate it. Over here sit big happy spies, and over here sit big happy burrowing animals. And you'd look at the other context around it, and that context, maybe it's a children's story about animals in the wilderness. It would move that by an iterative process. It would move it through what are called attention layers in the neural network. It would move that concept over to a more precise point. And it really is a point in some high dimensional vector space. That's all that's happening, is that the points, the words, I'm going to call them words, even though they're actually smaller than words, they're tokens very often, they sit at some point in a very high dimensional vector space of the order of 10,000 dimensions, which in some senses is not huge. And in a sense, one might think that 10,000 dimensions isn't nearly enough to describe everything that we would think about. actually, there's some really interesting maths that goes into this, that in 3 dimensions, if I give you 3 vectors, there are only 3 vectors which are almost orthogonal to each other in 3 dimensions. Okay, so in 3 dimensions, these ones are almost orthogonal to each other. Okay, well, I mean, they're pretty close to orthogonal. It turns out that in high dimensions, there are far more vectors that are almost orthogonal to each other than there are in low dimensions, which actually means that you can find more directions that are sort of different in some concrete mathematical sense than just the 10,000 of the number of dimensions. And so you seem to be able to fit in a lot more information into high dimensional vector spaces than one might have thought. So language models, although they're doing everything through this sort of connectionist perspective, that they are just, neural networks with a particular architecture, which just has a number of layers, and they perform this algorithm on the layers in this feed-forward fashion. They're doing so on things that seem to get meaning from their training, and the training is on, enormous amounts of text data. But they seem to encode in some very real way relationships between concepts. And you can move between those concepts and you can ask questions, sort of analogous questions. So you can actually do really interesting maths on the embedding space. So you can take the point, which is the point for queen, and you can take the point, which is the point for king, and you can take the point, which is the point for man, and that for woman. And there's an arrow going between man and woman and king and queen. And that arrow is the same between the 2 of them. So you can actually do maths, which is, for instance, what would it be? King minus man plus woman will actually take you to the point queen in the space. And I'm not going to go into the potential gender issues of this, but one can actually do this maths within the space. And it's not something that's been created by the people who set up the system. It just emerges out of the training. Does anybody know about the ARC challenge? Okay, good. Not many of you. So the ARC challenge is an AI challenge that Francois Chollet came up with. And essentially he said, all of these problems which are related to, solving problems in biology and law and maths, well, there's a huge amount of training data out there. And so these large language models that seem to be doing incredibly well on them, yes, there does seem to be some sort of creativity, a spark of creativity from time to time, but essentially they're just learning the distributions. So maybe a much harder thing to do is some challenge which involves many different types of thinking. And a lot of it is about sort of geometry, but I can give you this set of arrows, these relationships between the top and the bottom. And you could, I would imagine, very easily figure out, well, what should be in the question mark. Okay, so we see here that what's happening is that the enclosed black spaces are filled with yellow. That's all that's happening. And it's really easy for us to see that, or it's relatively easy, I should say, for us to see that. And so we can take that last image and we can say, okay, this is what should go in this last space. And the ARC challenge is Francois Chollet's idea of what sort of thing we might need to do, we need to get computers to do in order to get AGI, artificial general intelligence. And I don't think this is the full answer, but I do think that this is a really interesting thing. If we have something that we want to call AGI, well, it should be able to solve the types of problems that we find relatively easy. Okay. Yes, being able to, answer complex medical questions, that's great, but there's a very different type of intelligence, which is this sort of spatial intelligence, which, we have at hand and is very useful. So the types of solutions that people have come up with for this have been extremely broad, and some of them have just been the pure neural network way of doing things. And in fact, ChatGPT's O3, with a lot of thinking time, was able to do pretty well on this. But some of the best things have been a combination of the neural and the symbolic, essentially being able to manipulate symbols like coding symbols. So people have created networks which look at problems, create code, and then the code is run and is able to solve the problems, is able to do the computation. So this sort of symbolic manipulation alongside the connectionist perspective seems to be very good at this. Now, it's clear that, what's happening in the brain is happening through the pure connections. But again, that might not be the best way for us to get to AGI if AGI is what we actually want to get to. There's a really nice example called Othello GPT. Has anybody seen this paper? So Othello is it's a game, a sort of two-player game played on a board, and people trained a chat GPT-like system, an LLM, with games of Othello. And all they were given was the strings of the moves. So it was trained on just, A1, B3, C7, etc., in the same way that you might encode chess moves, slightly differently to how you would encode chess moves. And games like this it was trained on games like this. And so one might say, well, maybe then it can play these games. It can learn to play the games by looking at the patterns and learning the patterns. But actually, far more than that happened. When people probed inside the network, which we're able to do with things like large language models and neural networks in general, it was found that there were layers that corresponded to representations of the board space. So the analogy that people have come up with this is there's a raven sitting outside, and there's two people inside playing the game. And one person says, okay, I'm going to play this move, and they play the move. And the other person says, I'm going to play this move. And the raven outside hears the set of moves which are played, but it has no idea what a board move looks like. And you go outside, and all of a sudden you see that the raven has created a grid with the positions of the pieces on the board. That seems to be what's happening with this particular LLM trained on the game. It has created an internal representation where you can test whether or not certain board states are legal or not. So you can actually pass in a board state, and it will know, yes, this is a legal board state. This is a state that you can get to within the game, just by feeding it the sequences of moves from lots and lots of games that people have played. So there is this there's an internal representation, and sometimes we can read the internal representation, sometimes we can't. But it's interesting that there is something that feels like there's symbolic manipulation going on. There's some internal representation, which, yes, is encoded in the neurons, but there's something deeper than that going on. So Douglas Hofstadter has this commentary on LLMs where he said one thing that has completely surprised me. So I should say Douglas Hofstadter has spent most of his career thinking about creativity, thinking about how we think in a really deep way, and has come up with these ways of thinking about it, which are interesting and complex and nuanced. And he said one thing that has completely surprised me is that these LLMs and other systems like them are all feed forward. You just pass information in and it goes through and it outputs something. It's like the firing of the neuron is going only in one direction. I would never have thought that deep thinking could come out of a network that only goes in one direction, out of firing neurons in only one direction. And that doesn't make sense to me, but that just shows that I'm naive. And I think this idea of it only firing one direction is itself a little bit naive. Yes, through the neural network, that's all that happens. But there is a feedback system that the word that it outputs, it's then sort of within the memory. There is, even though it's not actually a recurrent network, that then becomes a part of the context that it uses for the next word. So it's not entirely true that it's all feed forward, but there's no sense in which unless it's in thinking mode, there's no sense in which the next word has been thought about in the context of what might be to come in the future. So as I'm talking now, in theory, the end of my sentence is already formed in there before I put out the first word. Okay? Maybe it's not conscious, but the end of the sentence is there, and then I put out each word. Whereas with an LLM, that's definitely, or it doesn't seem to be what's happening. It's only putting out one word, and then it says, okay, what's the next word I should put out? And what's the next word? And this seems really surprising, that some sort of intelligence is able to come about from such a very, very simple way of thinking. In fact, LLMs have really shaken Douglas Hofstadter. He says basically he can think of nothing else, and he's incredibly depressed by the fact that he thought there was something beautiful about thinking, about creativity. And yet this pretty ugly system seems to be able to do it all. And that leaves the question, so, what's special about human brains? And the answer might be, well, not very much. Okay, so I'm sort of aware of the time is ticking on, so I'm going to wrap up relatively soon. One thing that I do want to talk about is in terms of reinforcement learning. I apologize to those of you who don't know about reinforcement learning. Essentially, it's the machine learning task of saying, how do I get a computer to perform some sort of task, playing chess, for instance, by trial and error? And by trial and error, of course, what you need is some sort of signal that says, yes, you did well, or no, you did badly. So you have a computer, and that computer, that agent, as we call it, you can think of it as the brain. It has some policy where the policy just says, if you find yourself in this particular state, this is the thing you should do. Okay? If you find a chessboard in front of you and it looks like this is the thing you should do in this situation. And by feedback with an environment where the environment gives you feedback that says, yeah, that was good, or no, that was bad, you learn in the way that you learn to perform tasks by trial and error. And some of the time that will simply be that you just do it and you're not really thinking about it. Some of the time you will be creating an internal representation and you can then play that back in your mind. So there are lots of different ways of doing this. One of the really interesting things, actually two interesting things about this. One, has anybody seen the AlphaGo documentary? A couple of you. So the AlphaGo documentary, you can find it on YouTube. So Google DeepMind created the system AlphaGo that learned to play the game of Go, which is somewhat like chess, but is actually much, much more complex. Combinatorially, there are far more potential moves in Go than there are in chess. And nobody had thought that one could create a Go playing computer that could beat good humans. They did this using reinforcement learning through just trial and error learning, playing against itself many millions of times. And the amazing thing that happened, so they played it against the world champion, Lee Sedol, and it beat Lee 4 games to 5. But the most interesting move came in the second game in move 35 or 37, the numbers escape me now. And what happened was that actually Lee Sedol was out of the room at the time that the move was played. And when the move was played, the commentators around the world said, this is crazy. This is just a ridiculous move that no human would make. It clearly doesn't make any sense at all. And Lee Sedol, who was not only the world champion, but had been for a long time as certainly the greatest Go player of a generation, came back into the room and looked at it. And there's this comment at the bottom in the documentary. He says, this move was really creative and beautiful. He looked at it and he realized that this was a move that no human would ever play. But what it had done is it opened up an entirely new way of looking at the game. It had created something with value. And to me, creativity is the creation of something novel that has value. It's very easy to be creative in the sense of just creating randomness, but to create things that have value, that to me is the heart of creativity. And that's what it had done. It had created this new way of playing the game, which opened up something entirely new that no human had ever thought about before. So these systems, reinforcement learning systems in this case, do seem to be able to create novelty with value in a way which opens up new avenues of thought for us. It turns out that if you take the idea of deep learning, sort of neural networks, and reinforcement learning, and you put them together, then you can get these systems to play things like the Atari games, the old Atari games. And when Neatal in 2015, did this, they were able to get a computer to play at superhuman level on most of the Atari games. So the line that you see here, these are the scores on various different games, from pinball, boxing, breakout, and this says that this is a human level or above. So all of the ones above here, the computer was able to play the games above human level. All the ones below here, though, it wasn't. And in particular, Montezuma's Revenge, it got 0. It just couldn't get anywhere with it. So this is one of the examples where you look at where a system breaks down, where it doesn't do well, and you have to ask, what is it that we do differently to the way the computer plays? And in this case, the key, the ingredient that was able to take it from doing terribly to doing quite a bit better, not as good as humans yet, was curiosity. So the problem with this game is that it's what's called a sparse reward game. And that means that you have to do many things in a very particular combination before you get any signal at all as to whether you're doing the right thing. So if you're just moving around randomly in the game, you're very unlikely to discover this particular combination of moves, and you're not going to get any signal at all. You can add in another type of reward, which is an intrinsic reward. And that intrinsic reward says, do things that you are curious about, and you will be rewarded for that. And curiosity in a very explicit way in terms of going to states in the game that you know the least about. And it turns out that this is a really important ingredient, that extrinsic reward plus curiosity, you put them together and they are able to solve these sorts of problems. Problems where there might not be a really strong reward signal until way down in the game. Of course, when you get a human to play this, they are using analogy. They're using analogy because they played video games before. They know what a wall is. They know what a ladder is. They know what a key is. Okay? They're drawing analogies between the types of things that you do in the world. If you see a key, well, you know very well that the thing to do with this thing is to find a lock and put it in the lock. Whereas the computer is starting off without any of that knowledge at all. It's like it's a baby and it's moving around, but it is very curious. It's testing the world, and in that testing of the world in a very directed way, it is able to find, actually, this key here, it does something interesting when I put it over there, and even though I didn't know about this before. I think I'm not going to go into the details of this, of active inference. That's a whole nother lecture. But it is some work that I'm doing at the moment with Mark Solms and team, looking at what happens in a different paradigm to reinforcement learning. But when you put an agent in a foraging environment where there are multiple competing needs, and it has to figure out what's the right policy and learn that policy over time in order to keep all of its needs met. And in doing this, we're trying to think about what are the ingredients that make it relatively easy for animals to do this sort of balancing, whereas for machines, this sort of multi-objective system turns out to be very difficult. Okay. So I'm gonna stop there, but in summary, some of the things that I want you to take away is that maybe biological brains aren't necessary for anything that we do. Why do they need to be made of meat? Maybe a mixture of symbolic and neural encoding is the way to go. That is to say, at the moment, it seems that with the computational power that we have, just brute force alone may have some limitations, and adding in tool use gives these systems a lot more power. One way to think about this is that we know that LLMs are really bad at maths, at like arithmetic. You give it a multiplication of two 10-digit numbers and is likely to get it wrong. Give it access to a calculator and it'll get it right. So this relationship between tool use and LLMs seems to be very powerful. But the same is true of you. If I give you two 10-digit numbers and ask you to solve the problem in your head, you're unlikely to be able to do it. But I give you a tool, and in that case, it's pen and paper, and you can do things symbolically, then you're able to solve the problem. Analogy does seem to be at the heart of a great deal of what we do, and I think it's a really interesting thing to think about in an artificial intelligence sense. How do we build analogy engines into these things? We have models at the moment that act somewhat like humans, but there are certainly ingredients that are missing. And studying what is missing may guide us to understand what makes our brains do what they do. And I'm going to stop there. Yeah, any questions?
Would you like to ask a question or from Zoom, the moderator, Zoom questions?
Yeah, I think if anyone has questions, Zoom, you can run the chat. You will be able to speak. But if I may use a chance to ask, so I see there are two ways how tech community, artificial intelligence community treat LLMs and their potential as a source substrate for future AGI. And there I think different views. Some people like Jan Kuhn, they believe we no way near to that. So it's never going to be AGI. It will be some type of specialized intelligence which will be helpful. And some people they it's maybe I think majority of views in the community that okay it's soon a couple of years we will be there. And the another person organizer of this art AGI challenge, he made a quote that he said that until the point that we can create a task that easy for humans but hard to artificial intelligence, we're not near AGI. So it's still not AGI. But what do you think? Is it true? Is it true that do we need to build a machine that can solve whatever we can solve to be sure that okay, it's some kind of interesting creation there, that it can be more it can be general intelligence, so it can be sentient, whatever. So it started the conversation, or we will never be able to witness that system, and maybe we don't need to aim for a system that can solve whatever we can solve, and and even before that, it can be sentient and inject. So yeah, it was a bit.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Lots of things there. First of all, I don't think that a system needs to be sentient to be AGI. I think those are two separate things. I think that AGI is a really misunderstood term because nobody knows what it means. Because nobody has really defined it in any way which is satisfactory. People say, it's AGI when it can do most useful human tasks. Like, how do you define most useful human tasks? I think that's pretty difficult. I think that there are lots of different perspectives to this. I think that, don't listen to Sam Altman when he says that AGI is around the corner. They've got good reason to say that. I think that Jan LeCun also has a sort of bias because he's come up with the energy-based models. And I think, there is some sort of politics, maybe isn't quite the word, but certainly sort of psychology going into this, where he doesn't like the fact that people have, put everything into the attention mechanism and transformers. We've certainly been surprised again and again how good they are and what they can do. I do think that it's going to be, the next step is going to be about tool use. And I think that LLMs on their own are unlikely to get there, but LLMs plus tool use seems to be, there's a huge amount of room for improvement at the moment. Whether this is going to get us to something that we would call AGI, I think my tendency is to say yes. I think it probably will. However you want to, defining AGI is tricky. And I think probably AGI does lead to artificial superintelligence. I do think that this is the kind of beginning of the exponential, or some way along the exponential of the singularity in the Ray Kurzweil language, that once we have systems that can do all the things that we can do, or many of the useful computational things that we can do, they will be able to, for instance, come up with new architectures and new forms of computation and new mathematics. As soon as you have a single agent that is above human intelligence, then it's going to be in the interests of whatever government is in charge of the country that does that to put that on 10,000 computers, or even more than that, and get them all running. And now you've got a huge number of sort of super scientists all doing things. Then there's a multi-agent problem of how do you get these agents to talk to each other in a useful way. So there are lots of problems along the way, but I do think that probably LLMs plus tool use is going to be enough to get us a very long way.
Yeah, I believe so. If LLMs can can solve RC AGI challenge, they can definitely manipulate some human to solve it with them,
Sure.
which is
I also wonder, like, how this discussion is, I feel this is a discussion where we're constantly moving goalposts, which is part of, like, I think that this kernel Chauvinism that you say, like, I agree a lot with that idea. And for example, I think that last year at the end, when O3 was released, like, they were saying, like, yeah, this beat the ARC stuff. And I Googled, I was like, yeah, like the ARC 1 was beaten.
That's right, yeah.
But now there's the ARC 2 where it's like only 5%. And just so like, yeah, like when it's 90% in ARC 2, are they gonna release the ARC 3? So
Yeah,
we're just like this discussion is never gonna be resolved because like we're just moving the goalposts until like AGI happens. You know, like, so I feel like
I think it's unlikely to happen that way. I do think the goalpost will move for some time. So in fact, ARC 3 I think has already been set up. It's already written. I think what we're more likely to see is that yes, the goalpost will be moved a bit over time, but nobody really talks about the Turing test anymore. So for those of you who don't know, the Turing test is essentially a test to say, if I'm talking to a screen and behind that screen is either a computer or a human, am I able to tell which one it is? Is it a computer or a human? And at some time in the last 10 years, people stopped asking whether that was possible and stopped really thinking that it was a very interesting test. And it may well be that at some time in the next couple of years, people just stop talking about the ARC challenge. It's just not an interesting thing. It's it's obvious now that it's solved. And so I think it's probably going to be a matter of moving the goalpost for a little while, and then all of a sudden, that's just people will look at the ARC challenge and go, "What a ridiculous challenge to give a computer." Of course it can do that. And now here's something else. So I think it's going to be different sorts of problems, and maybe it's going to be problems in robotics at that time. Can you get a robot to do some interesting multi-agent thing, or pour a cup of coffee? This is all been a question. I don't remember who it was, but who said, we will have seen real progress when you can put a robot into any kitchen that can just go and make a cup of coffee. Because of course, again, through analogy, you can do that. You might not have seen that particular kettle before, but you know what kettles look like. You know how to turn things on, and so you know what to do. And so to have a robot that can do that in any kitchen, that's going to be a really interesting thing. And so I think there are lots of goalposts, and some of them are moving, and some of them are still kind of quite static because we're not nearly there. But I think that what's happening at the moment is that the goalposts move and we get closer and closer and closer, and then all of a sudden it's just not an interesting problem. I think there was a question here. Yeah.
Thanks for the. I was interested about what you said at the very beginning about how you created the presentation with Gamma.
Yeah.
And it made me think about like in my experience, there seems to be two kind of ways, at least people who are not deep in the AI field, use AI, primarily LLMs. And one is to edit content, and one is to produce content, to create content. And I think even if we kind of take the assumption with this definition of creativity that you give, that it is novelty with value. So we say, okay, maybe there's no difference between human and machine creativity, even if we assume that, which is a big assumption coming from an artistic field stuff. If you ask the artists, they do not agree with that at all. And there's a lot of ethical issues with it as well. But even if we take that, I think it's something that I don't see discussed enough is that all production of content and all sharing of content has an ideological bias. And we talked a little bit, I think, earlier on in the kind of LLM development about the biases of the early models, but we're not talking about that now. And especially when people use AI to produce something new. And I think especially I've seen when people who don't understand how AI models work, they kind of accept that at face value. And the information is often incorrect. We know that LLMs hallucinate information. People don't understand that. And it cannot give the kind of advice based on an ideological position that a human would. And maybe we don't know. So maybe if we understand the algorithm behind the model, we know where that positionality is coming from. but in a more complex system, as you were saying, it's maybe indistinguishable from a human. Where is that positionality coming from? Where is the ideology coming from? Is that a problem?
Great questions. I mean, to a certain extent, I would say that you as an individual have taken in information from the environment around you, and so you have your particular biases, as does everybody. And the LLM, the biases that it has are a choice of the particular information that's been fed into it. I do think, you know, one can steer an LLM into a particular positionality. So you can give it a personality and say, you know, given that this is your worldview, can you give an answer? So it's possible to sort of steer it. I would say so, because I'm living in South Africa. Within Africa, there is still a lot of talk about bias, both in the sort of, you know, the image type machine learning tools and LLMs. So, you know, biases, I think, are still a really important part of the conversation. I think this creativity idea, you know, the fact that essentially it's sort of, well, we can think of it in two ways. So with LLMs, yes, it's taking all this information in and making sort of statistical predictions based on the information that is taken in, and whatever it creates is a consequence of that, plus some noise. I would say that that's not far off what humans do as well. We take in information, we form a model of the world and our own thought processes, and then with a little bit of noise, we output things. One of the problems with LLMs is that because they've taken in so much information, what you get out tends to be a pretty kind of generic, broad, fairly bland thing that has lost a lot of the nuance. But I think there are ways to undo that and to steer it in more nuanced directions. But the user really needs to know what they're doing there. They need to understand that without doing that, they are going to get something which will be biased in a particular way. So yeah, I think it's a major problem. I don't know if that's a good answer to the question, but yeah, I think it's a super interesting question. Yeah. Yeah.
Right then, so
Please.
then, one of the high level questions that I thought of, have several, maybe I'll come back to others later, but you talked about the idea of creativity for you being a combination of novelty and value. Novelty might be something that can be objectively measured, but who determines the value? Where does that come from?
Great.
Especially with the computer.
Yeah.
Content.
So I think that the Go example is a sort of very simple example of that, where there is clearly value in that the aim is to win the game. So in that sense, the value is very clear. I do think that the artistic perspective, it's a much more nuanced question. You know, to paint a picture, and to do so in a creative way, it's much harder to pin down value because that may be to do with the aesthetics of those who look at it, or you know the emotion that it creates in people, whatever it might be. So I think that outside of the sort of reinforcement learning context, it's much harder to pin down what value means. I do know that oh gosh, what's his name? Ken Robinson, who did the famous TED Talk Schools Kill Creativity.
Yeah.
He's got a book about creativity, and in fact, that definition essentially came from his talk. That idea of novelty and value. But yeah, I think the value question comes back to the bias question as well. You know, what value means to one person is going to be very different to another. Yeah, I don't know if it definitely doesn't answer it.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if there, yeah, is there a potential answer at all, and does it depend on the domain? So in Go, you said that the value can come from the fact that there's a winning state. I rather thought about that as that the value comes from the fact that there is a bounded possibility state space on the game. A priori, by definition of the rules, and then the algorithm found a portion of that space that not be explored yet.
That's true.
That was actually still useful.
Yep.
Obviously, the whole space is maybe containing large portions which are not useful to know about. Although it's not clear that we know that a priori, but like yeah. But then, if you talk about art, And the aesthetics might determine the value of the art. Say a painting. It's easier to understand even the meaning of that statement, and definitely the truth of it before AI generate art was possible.
Yeah.
Because people had to make the paintings.
Yeah.
For somebody to appreciate them.
Mhm.
But once the AI can make the paintings, even though somebody might be looking at the painting and saying, or digital rendering, let's say, first of all, digital rendering can't make a painting. But yeah, then they may get an aesthetic value from that.
Yeah.
But is it still like, is it valuable? Because now you
Sure.
can make as much of that kind of mediocre crap as you like.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well,
So I don't know. And then, yeah. I guess there's a bunch of questions forming off of that, but I have to
yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, when you say mediocre, so there was this famous example that came along, I think, soon after DALL-E. Oh no, I think it was Midjourney came out, where somebody created an image and it won a painting competition, it won a fine art competition, and so at least the judges of that thought it was beyond mediocre. You know,
yeah,
and
so that's something that I may have misspoken, but yeah, it's more in the sense of that there's a regression to the mean.
sure,
Like not that the art itself is any different,
right. Yeah.
but that now you can produce so much of that whatever it was able to train itself on,
yeah,
can be reproduced. That kind of stuff can be reproduced infinitely.
Yeah.
Is it going to be able to explore the possibility space?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah,
because if you take the stuff that it can produce and feed it back in as more training content,
yeah,
you won't get outside of whatever you had in the first place.
So what one could think about there would be having a reinforcement learning system where it's changing its policy of how it does art based on how people react. And it could then start to explore, using curiosity, parts of the possibility space that aren't in the original training set, and realize that if I do this thing, then humans are, the humans react in some strong affective way to that. So the way LLMs are trained and the way reinforcement learning, yes, there's reinforcement learning in LLMs, but the way reinforcement learning works, I think it's easier to think about exploring those out of distribution spaces. I think there's another really interesting thing, which is that I could give you a painting and tell you that it's painted by a person, and you will think that it's maybe beautiful, partly because you then have some sense of what the person who created it might have been feeling at the time. And that's an important part of the experience, is that you feel connected to another person. And then if I tell you, actually, no, this was created by a machine, all of a sudden you can imagine that feeling just evaporating. The thing is exactly the same, but it's relational is really important. What then happens when and if we do create sentient machines, which do themselves have affect? Does it then become possible to call the output of the computer more creative in an artistic sense because the machine was having an experience when it did it? I don't know. I mean, in some sense that feels intuitive, but I don't know. Yeah.
In my cognitive basis of everyday and expert performance course, I have a lecture on creativity, and there I define creativity pretty much the way you did, so like novelty with value. However, I don't use the word value there. I break it down into performance and success. So the creativity would be novelty that increases performance, or novelty with success. And like in some domains, like in sports or games, you can have like an objective performance measure, and then you can define creativity as novelty with higher performance than before. And then it is debatable whether this is the case in art, or whether art is all about success, how many things you can sell, or what reactions you get in people, because performance is what you produce. Success depends on how other people perceive your performance. So there's a good book by Albert Panavasi, The Formula, where they done like this success formula. So success is your past performance times what's the fitness times your past performance, and that comes from the perception of other people.
Okay.
So I find it very useful to look at it from the when you're breaking down the value into definable performance or then this success factor, which are very different dynamics.
Yeah.
Because performance is limited, but success is unlimited.
Yeah.
So you can have somebody who, for example, with money as the success measure, can have 1 trillion times more money than another person, but they cannot run 1 trillion times faster than another person.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. I think the Go example, that move 35 or 37, was both interesting from a performance and success perspective, because in the game it was clearly useful, but it also was something which, you know, there was clearly outside value, which essentially said, this is useful for other people. This is a good way to think about it. And essentially then people then took that Go playing agent and sort of reproduced versions of it, which could then, you know, train other people to play Go. So I guess, yeah, in the sense this had both of those values.
Yes. Yeah. Whereas the Turing test example you had, then it was maybe big news first when you get to that level, but then higher level of performance no longer generates the kind of success because people lose interest. Both pot is no longer like relevant.
Last comment then, that we kind of are approaching the edge of this idea, so I'll just bring it up, just to wrap up. Relates to Moravec's paradox. Moravec's paradox, and this relates to the robotics team you talked a bit about. And if we go back to the example of the art, painted art, let's say, computers are only producing them in digital representation format. There are no real paintings. To me, this question there, like, is there a challenge beyond the ACR challenge, let's say, a challenge for the intelligence of these machines that lies in, like, when we take away state space representation, if we stop doing that for them, then what can they do?
Right.
What kind of a painting could a great painting algorithm produce if it then has to make the painting for real?
Sure.
And I don't know if there's any relevance to the your talk in that, but I think something lies beyond what has been thought of and discussed so far. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole, I think it ties in also to the ideas of embodied cognition, and, you know, how much having a body affects the intelligence of the system, and that's for another talk.
Definitely.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks again, John.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. Bye bye, everyone. Cheers to online.